So welcome. We're going to be talking about wilderness medicine and research. We've got an exquisite team I get to play with and have been doing so for years. We're going to cover a bunch of different things, but as much as anything, we want this to be an opportunity for you to learn and to think about how you can take your ideas and move them forward in a productive and fun fashion. For me, I'm Stuart Harris. I'm the fellowship director at Mass General Hospital in Boston. For me, wilderness medicine started off as it's just a further extension of exploring. Spent some time in Asia and in the Everest area, and it's just in whitewater boating. That just the idea of what's around the corner, what's the next over the ridge down at the bottom of that waterfall as you run it is always been something that's been kind of fun. And I think too often research, it's just this god-awful dry, almost a screening mechanism to keep people out of med school, to keep people away from the bedside. And that's not what we want in medicine. That's sure as hell not what I want, in my residents or fellows, or when I'm a patient one day, not what I want at the bedside. So it's people who are curious and are trying to figure out how the world works. And for me, how the world works is really about how medicine is not working. So seeing medicine as something that's locked within hospital walls, as health is in that narrow stricture. And so for the last 20 years, for me, wilderness medicine has been about lifting up that idea of health being other than an ecological phenomena. So the ecology breeds health, not vice versa. And how you can pursue that is any of a variety of ways. It can be big kind of like climate change work. It can be small inhaled nitric oxide work for COVID. It can be altitude work. And through, I think, the three of the rest of the team, we're going to walk through ideas on how do you come up with research ideas that are valid, that are important, that are fun, and that allow you to move your career forward in emergency medicine. Anybody want to? Sure. Yeah.
All right, passing the torch. Hey, so Henderson McGinnis, I'm at Wake Forest. I'm our fellowship director. I've been hanging out with these guys for a long time. They've been carrying me along. I've been riding their coattails for a long time. Research, like kind of Stuart alluded, research to me was kind of a dirty word. Like, oh, I don't want to do research because I did that in undergrad, like, injecting mice and dissecting muscle tissue and stuff like that. And I'm like, now, as cool as that sounds to do in the wilderness setting, it's actually kind of fun. But I'm like, God, I don't want to do research. I just want to go and practice medicine. But research is really when you have a question about something. And there's a lot of really bad research in the world. And when you look at research in wilderness medicine, there's not a lot of high-quality research. So that's what we really need to do is churn out some high-quality research. So how do we do that? Like, how do we come up with a good idea? Like, who has a good idea? Who has an idea? We get 3 ideas from this group that we're going to work on collaboratively for research. What's some question? So how do you come up with a question for research, right? So true that the cricket noise does help, right? Sometimes you're like, oh, what is the effect of cricket noise on ambient temperatures in the room? Usually makes the speaker's personal temperature rise a little bit because no one's laughing at their jokes or no one's paying attention to them. But think about when you have a question. That's what it starts with. Is you have a question about something, like, hey, what would be the best way to treat this? Or how would I treat this if I didn't have X, Y, Z? If I don't have the donut of truth, how can I figure out if this person has a brain hemorrhage? How can I figure out if this person has an appy, right? So how do you do something when you don't have something else? Or how do you do something? What's the best way to do something? What's the best way to treat acute mountain sickness? What's the best way to treat athlete's foot, right? So have a question that you want an answer to and go and look and see, has anyone ever looked at this before, right? And sometimes there's going to be nothing in there. Sometimes there's going to be things in there that are like what's the classic research tool in wilderness medicine? The survey, right? I mean, it's the classic tool in most emergency medicine research, right? It's a survey because it's easy to do. You get a lot of data. You don't have any barriers to it. Even people who have zero research skills can do it like I do. And it's like, but it's really hard to design a well-designed study and a well-designed research study, right? When you're saying, oh, just base it on a survey, unless you know what questions you're looking for. So coming into it, like, seriously, what are the questions? What's on everybody's mind right now? What's one big topic? You guys know everything? Come on, somebody in the back row that's about to sleep. Their head down. What do you think?
Impact of climate change on search and rescue.
Okay, so that's a great story, and I think there's been some studies looking at the impact of climate change on participation in events, right? So how can we spin that out? How would you spin that out?
I start with database reviews and start to look and see what data sources are already available to look retrospectively, and then see if there's something interesting, and if there is something interesting, probably look prospectively as well.
So that's a great approach, right? You kind of have a big general picture of a question, and then you say, well, what data is out there? What resources do I have access to? Because what happens, and all the mistakes I made for doing most of my research, I had a question and I would just jump right into the question without looking to see what was available out there and what data was already done. So I did all this work on trying to collect data and sifting through the data after the fact, trying to put together your questions and trying to say, how am I answering this question with this data that was incompletely gathered or gathered in error, that was really not well organized or well orchestrated at the beginning. So coming up with a generalized question and then saying, what are my resources out there? And then how do I look at those resources and then fine tune my question a little bit more, right? And say, all right, so we're going to look at environmental impact on climate change, on outdoor rec or search and rescue, right? So did we see more people going to parks? So then we're going to have to look at that. We know that during COVID we had a bigger increase in the number of people that were participating in outdoor activities. So we'll have to get the statisticians to help us figure out how that changes things, right? And then say, okay, based on ignoring that obvious bump, did we see more people get involved with climate change and with other things in the outdoors? Because they were involved, did we have more search and rescue activations, right? Or did we have fewer search and rescue activations? And then you want to look and see, did those search and rescue activations happen because people were really hurt? Or because they have that cool little spot transmitter or the little inReach and said, hey, come pick me up, I'm out of water. Right? There was a case report where the folks there's a rafting trip in the Grand Canyon that hit their spot locator 3 times. It's like the boy who cried wolf. Finally, they're like, we're taking you guys out of here because you clearly shouldn't be here, right? So really starting with that big question, right? Thinking about what you want to answer the question about. And then, what are my resources? What's available to me to actually look at the data? What's there? And then say, all right, now this is my big global question. These are the resources that are available. What can I sort of dive into a little bit more and get more out of and have a better sort of well-defined, clearly delineated way to go with that? And my colleagues will be able to do a lot more in-depth sort of discussion on how you sort of actually craft the research process, and the other part is how do you pay for it, right? And then that's the big thing, because at my institution we do a lot of cardiovascular research because if it doesn't make dollars, it don't make sense. So these folks they bring the money in, and so the wilderness research pays $0. It's basically me, paying med students or giving med students money to go do stuff and trying to encourage them to do things. But how do you access funding for those sort of things? Right? And that's a whole different topic and a whole other thing. And then the other part is once you've gathered all the data, how do you put it together? And folks will talk about that as well. How do you put it together, and how do you translate that into something meaningful so that you share your work with the rest of the world and you get that out there so that people say, oh, I had that question too. And this is, okay, so they've already done the work. Now I can expand on their work, or I can cite their work, or I can move forward and do something totally different and ignore their work. And, but it's getting that last piece of translating what you've done into a product that can then be shared with everyone to help increase the body of knowledge that we have to allow us to provide better care to our patients and recreate safer, right? So pass this off to my next colleague. I think they're trying to game plan who's going to talk next. As you can tell, we love slides.
And we got beautiful ones. I don't
We do,
know why
right?
we didn't.
So this is our placeholder. We love to do this. I usually get a lot of grief because I don't use a lot of slides, and when I do, it's usually the same slide of some scenery or something, or a cartoon or something. So really, we try to give you the chance to get engaged and be involved with this, right?
And just as whoever's stepping up, don't ever let funding stand in the way of what your curiosity is. So 20 years ago, if I would have waited for funding, I would be sitting doing something much less fun right now. So there inevitably, research aligns itself around the axis of, well, where can I get money? And right now, especially if you're interested in climate change, we've got this bizarre siloing of the NIH is funding health and the National Science Foundation is funding climate research, as if the two aren't integrally related. And I've had talks with Obama's chief science advisor at some length. They're saying, this is stupid. This is just maladaptive in the idea that, health doesn't have its origins in a working biosphere. It's just strange. But until we get to that point, and if you want to study altitude, if you want to study undersea hyperbaric medicines, there are all ways that you can address your curiosity in a very frugal manner. So don't fall into that rat trap of, well, I can't find funding. It's like BS. Be curious and figure out what you want to figure out, and with that, you can do some cool stuff.
And I think kind of leveraging on that, the wilderness medicine aspect of what we do, right? We adapt, overcome, improvise. Kind of that's from my time with Outward Bound with Guns. But that's what we do in wilderness medicine. We're very flexible. We see a process and a problem, and we adapt to it and make the most of it. So you don't have to have big grant funding to do these things. And sometimes you can get started with a small, just to seed money from your department or even your own pocket, and then be able to tie into other funding sources.
Again, we're all very concerned about our intellectual property being taken, so you guys are all welcome to take this slide. So I'm the least fun of the group. I'm Sanjay Gupta. I'm emergency medicine. Sanjay Gupta. I always have to preface that sometimes. So I've been a wilderness medicine educator. I'm a department chair as well, and some of us can't really leave. So we think about wilderness being maybe out of hospital, out of network type research, and it does occur. And actually, there are a bunch of folks here, and they're going to speak, who've done a substantial amount of work out of country, out of sea level, out of a lot of places, and they're going to talk. But I'm going to just kind of take a little bit, I don't want to say more practical approach, but what if you can't really leave? Like, what if you don't have that opportunity due to your situation at home, your situation at work, just other responsibilities? And I think there's the ability to get involved with research that is impactful with wilderness medicine. When we talk about wilderness medicine, we're talking about resource-limited medicine and whatever that comes. And there's a whole bunch of little arms that come off. So if you've been to any of our talks, you can look all day. I don't think there's any one unifying definition necessarily. You can always take any arm and make it your own. You're going to run into the same challenges that you do with any other research. You got to think about human subjects protection. So you have to go through an IRB. But if your thought is, hey, I'm going to do this research in Nepal, who are you doing that research with? How does that IRB work? Is this partner? Do you have to get an MOA? MOU, sorry, not MOA. So it's these sort of things you got to think about as you're going through your project. You may want to find some trusted sources to speak to, because I'm always one that leans toward just do it and ask for forgiveness later. It's not always going to work if you go down that pathway. Because people don't, and people meaning they're folks that impact your ability to do the work that you want to do, who may not understand your passion in a way. And they may want to put you in a box in some extent. So you have to kind of unpack your thoughts and your motivations and make this very deliberate as you do this. So get those trusted sources in and talk about how you are going to maintain this project in a place that is not a kind of regular and normal place to do traditional research in your site. So things, data storage, confidentiality, consent, all that stuff. You have to think about that before you kind of rush off. And even if you do a survey somewhere, do you need all these things for that survey? So just kind of the practical approach. Some of the other things. So what if you really can't get away? How can you do wilderness type research where you are? How do you kind of meet this thought, this idea, And how do you make this impactful with what you're doing? And there are big ways to do it. And we see this happening now in a lot. When you walk around these plenary sessions around SAEM, when you're looking at a lot of big data, right? You have some of these big health systems that are like pulling data out of their EHRs or out of systems they have. So I work in a system that has almost 900,000 pre-pandemic ED visits a year. That's a lot of people. Now, can I come up with a question utilizing that access to that data? So if I think about it, we were just talking about climate change. What's the impact on your EMS? What's the impact on your emergency department on that first unexpected hot weather day of the year? What's the impact of that Spartan race? I have no affiliation with Spartan, but that Spartan race that comes into your local stadium for the first time. How does that impact your ED visits? How does that impact your EMS system? What's the ripple effect? So there's so many ways to kind of incorporate the idea of climate, about outdoor racing, things like that, where you don't necessarily have to leave your department. So if you don't have the ability to do that, there are ways to think about utilizing data that does come to you with the impact of the environment around. So, there are different ways to do wilderness research. And we were talking about funding, and there are huge grants that are available. There are also grants that are available for seeding. So there are different organizations that have grants, and you guys can look for them. How many med students in here? All right, you guys got the golden ticket, just so you know. So there is an organization called the Wilderness Medical Society. It's the professional society of wilderness medicine. Paul Auerbach was one of the founders. He just recently passed away. But there are a number of grants with this organization. They're not huge. They're really largely more seed grant amounts, but not as many people apply for these as they should. A lot of the grants are not really that well written. I'm on the grants committee, so I'm saying this from experience. And they're not always funded, just honestly due to quality of the grants or the number of grants going in. So the reason I'm saying med students, they often don't get a ton of grants going that way. So if you're not a med student and you want a grant, find a med student, adopt a med student, and make that med student the PI. So there are a number, but even it's even expanded. So there's a legacy grant from in EMF with ASAP, which is more targeted toward climate and outdoors. So there are different ways to find funding, and think about different collaborators.
Also, there was a grant that we were recently looking at that the National Science Foundation was looking for, like climate change research. It was a lot. It was like millions of dollars for what you're talking about, where you're looking at data sets and mathematical modeling of that, which was big numbers compared to the stuff that we usually look for wilderness research.
Yeah, absolutely. So you think about now, you mentioned modeling, big data, a lot of AI, a lot of utilization of these tools. It's all coming into frame. We can crunch so much more information than we ever could before. So we're starting to do this at some low level in my health system, not really wilderness related, but the opportunity is absolutely there for that funding. And the other thing to do is, even if you don't feel like you're a strong expert, think about collaborating. And I'll give you an example. With our local university, I actually collaborated with one of the ecologists to get one of these grants a few years ago. I don't know anything about horseshoe crabs, but I do know that environmental changes impact horseshoe crabs. And why are horseshoe crabs impactful to us? Blood, right? So the blood of the horseshoe crab has copper in it. It's used to check the sterility of IV medications with pharmaceuticals. So if you don't have horseshoe crabs, you may be sending out tainted drugs. So looking at this, we collaborated with the grant with Hofstra, which is our local university, to write one of these grants. It also helps that he was one of my friends from college, but it's okay. That's the aside. But so there are a lot of opportunities in there that even if you don't feel as strong with grant writing, to partner with scientists where this is impactful across the spectrum of kind of basic science, ecological science, and health science is huge. So you just got to be I don't want to say creative, but use that agility that we have, use that flexibility that we have in emergency medicine, and even more so in wilderness medicine with changing conditions. So that's kind of my shtick, that even with all this fun stuff that you can do, all of those things that you need to do in terms of getting your IRBs and getting your approvals, ability to travel, all the pre-work. If you're traveling somewhere for distance research, you have to think about yourself and your own health. Do you have to go through a series of vaccinations or, pre-travel checklists? So all that stuff has to be done that may not have to be done in other types of research. And again, if you don't feel by your circumstance or even your interest that you can travel to do research like this, think about the ways that you can do this at your local site, because there are always going to be ways to be creative to do this. All right? Any questions? Anyone? We're not supposed to talk at you. We're supposed to talk to you. Is this anyone?
Hey, Jay.
Yeah.
I just, circling back to the idea of stuff that you can do at your own place without necessarily traveling to Nepal, which is awesome and cool. I've done a lot of work just based on looking at small devices that might potentially have advantages for austere providers. My first study was with a student looking at iPhone pulse oximeters. Do they work? And then we moved to actually testing pulse oximeters, and then we actually got published during the COVID pandemic because it became really important to know whether these handheld pulse oximeters work, and it turns out that they do. And my current study is working on the handheld, like the cardiomobile devices, and testing another one to see whether they correlate well with EKGs. And these are all studies that I've done with essentially no funding, with interested medical students who collect the data in the emergency department. All stuff's done in my ED, but has applications for an austere provider, even though I haven't done it in an austere setting. So again, things that you can do without leaving your emergency department still are potentially wilderness medicine or austere medicine related. So.
All right. Yep. Thanks, Walt. That's exactly right. Look around at the resources around you. There's so many things to test. We think about wilderness, but really think about resource-limited environments and like that sort of impact that Walt would have. It's going to help you on a plane, right? You guys know about, this is just an example. You guys know about the medical kits that are on planes in North America? Haven't been updated. The contents have not been updated since the 1980s. And there are absolutely no resources for pediatric patients in these kits. So you should take a look at what's in these kits and then figure out the other stuff that you need around. But things like this, biosensors, wearables, this is going to be huge to help us, but this is going to be helpful everywhere. And it's going to be helpful mainly in these resource-limited places. So that's a great example. All right. Any questions? Anyone? Everybody, my health system CMO is here watching, just so you know. So make sure I get a lot of good remarks about my portion here. All right. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Hillary Irons. I'm from UMass. And it's great to be able to do a lot of this stuff at home, but you guys all wandered into a wilderness medicine talk, so I'm assuming that you probably like going outside. And what if you actually want to do your research outside and in one of these austere environments? So there's a lot of things you can answer at home, use big data for, but a lot of things you can't, and sometimes you have to go into the field. So you got to really think about the logistics of that. So if we, it's important to really kind of formulate your idea, so not just like the big, like what, the effect of climate change, what was it, the effect of climate change on search and rescue? Was that the idea before? So do you want to like hone that into a particular area? Are we talking about search and rescue like across the board? Do we want to like focus on North America? And if there's a particular type of, are we looking at, natural disasters impacting it? Like really kind of narrowing it down so you have a question that is easily answered. And then coming up with the way that you're going to answer that question. So I've done a bunch of different research projects from, lab rats to like outdoor things where, surveys, sure, but, other kinds of projects and in several different environments. So probably the climate change search and rescue isn't going to be a very good lab rat project. Probably doesn't answer the question. And it's probably not a very good survey question, answer either. So whoever came up with the idea, any ideas of how you would start that?
Maybe looking at, like, there's probably a database out there, right, that has some sort of longitudinal data
Yeah, would you want to like narrow that to be North America or a particular state or?
Yeah, I think one obvious one would be maybe work within the parks, like the national park system.
That's a good idea because probably those data sets may be formulated in a similar way. So synthesizing all that data into one bigger database might be a lot easier than trying to, pull data from different places, right? We've all been in different like EMRs where like it doesn't quite jive and like the numbers aren't quite the same. And if this lab value is slightly different from that lab value because they do a slightly different test, and the D-dimer from this hospital isn't correlatable to this other one. So pulling in one system like parks is a good idea. So let's say you want to do something a little bit, farther. You want to go international. There's definitely some logistical things to kind of overcome with that. So, maybe some place to look for climate change is in the Arctic or the Antarctic, because like the polar regions are really important. And you can talk about going to Alaska, which is great, or places like Siberia or Norway to do climate research. So, and each one of those places have their own challenges. So, obviously Alaska is, domestic, and that's helpful because, and they speak English. But maybe it don't have all the data that you need or all the details. But you're probably gonna have to work with groups that do that. So, anyone have any other like burning research questions? We really want this to be kind of an interactive discussion,
And they can be completely unfounded. I mean, just, what is of particular interest to you?
I have current projects that I need help with if no one else has things to talk about.
yeah, let's hear them.
Sounds damn good.
So we recently did what is now turning into a feasibility study. We were trying to ultrasound people on a dive boat. It's like a bunch of emergency medicine residents with me. And we wanted to look at what we got IRB approval for is to look at IVC collapsibility, like pre and post dive. But really, it should just be a feasibility study of can you ultrasound from a dive boat? That was the difficulty of it, which we could, but only in certain conditions. But I don't know how to write that up. I don't know how to turn that into a project, especially because it's completely different from what I set up to do. The data we collected, because the data we collected on IVC collapsibility didn't really make a lot of sense. Everyone's IVC was bigger, but not more collapsible. So I don't know if there's some peripheral shunting that caused that. So maybe that part of it is, but I don't know what to do with the data now.
Yeah. Well, so it brings up a couple of good points. Like, first of all, like getting your gear to the dive boat. And were you in the U.S. or were you somewhere else?
We were in Belize.
In Belize. So first of all, getting all your equipment down to whatever country you're in, getting the approval to do it, I'm sure you had to go through not just the IRB at your home institution, but probably the Belizean version of the IRB.
Well, we didn't if we were supposed to.
Okay. So many countries, and I don't know about Belize, but many countries have one of those, and they can be more or less difficult to get your study through those particular ones because they have certain hoops, and they may or may not speak English. You might have to have someone local to help you out with that. But then getting your equipment there and making sure that it's going to work. I mean, how did you power it? Off a battery power?
We used a butterfly, and so yeah, we just charged it in our hotel rooms every night in between, and it lasted the scan sessions. Probably did like 2 hours of full scanning each day. So yeah, that actually we went off without much trouble.
Oh, that's great, because we've used a bunch of solar power things, and if you're up at altitude and it's cold, batteries don't last very long, and there's all kinds of potential issues with keeping your data at high altitude, because some of the computers aren't rated that high. So that's great. As far as your data that you've got, you can actually write a methods paper and just kind of talk about your methods. So that's an option. And those papers maybe that are not quite as impactful as ones that have a lot of data. But taking that and just saying, hey, this was the feasibility of it. And I don't think a lot of people publish as many negative results as we should probably have out there. There are a lot of states that say, you know what, this didn't work. In fact, maybe there should be a journal of negative results. There's not. But it would actually be kind of helpful, right? And then you wouldn't have to repeat that, say, oh, well, that didn't work. Maybe there should be something else. But you can spin it in a positive way and say, well, this was really helpful, this didn't, and the next time we would do it a different way.
And can I tie the two things into the same publication? Like, hey, we had negative results, but we also discovered that you kind of could alter some people on a moving episode. Like,
Yeah,
roll that in the same thing?
I think you could. I think you definitely could.
Okay.
So I would say actually make it 2 publications. You're in academics, you want to get double bang for your buck, right? And so, but the other part is start thinking about your audience, right? So you can do something, if you don't have IRB approval, you can still talk about how you could functionality use this equipment in this environment, right? And that's actually set up perfectly for like Journal of Special Operations Medicine, or even the instructor training portions for the Wilderness Environmental, Medicine Journal. There's like, how do you function in this environment? How do you use this equipment in this environment to gather data, to gather results? We did this as part of a study, and that study didn't really give us good results, but we found that this is how this worked. So like you were saying, make a feasibility study, but really more of that's what they were saying, the methods of that, the way you did it, but it's really applicable because you can say, this is how you do it, these are the things, these are the shortcomings we had, these are the things we would do differently, these are the things that will help you be more successful with that. And it gets around IRB as well from that standpoint, because you didn't really gather data. Not saying I can help you short details, but I can.
And I think that's a brilliant, if I can just follow up on, the idea of wilderness medicine as expanding healthcare to where people are in need, so not requiring people to come to our ED to receive a basic human right. And as you're describing it, thinking about the technologies in your life, and we live in just a feckin' time where we've got remarkable technologies coming online every day. I mean, the butterfly, just to go back, when I started in 2003, 05, we were in the Everest Base Camp area and looking at different projects. And one of them, a dear colleague, Vicki Noble, who started the MGH ultrasound program, we were just chatting in line, and she had just read some papers from Italy about lung ultrasound. And we were thinking about, well, HAPE, nobody's described ultrasonography for HAPE before. And we started looking, it's like, really, nobody's taken an ultrasound outside the hospital. And so just that what was in a brand new technology, a Sonosite 180, and the ability to go out into the field, part of it was just exactly like you're describing of being on a boat. It's like people are saying, they're fragile, they're expensive, they're gonna break, they're gonna freeze, you don't have any electricity. And just now, they're ubiquitous, they're around the world, and appropriately so. So a huge portion of what we can be doing is finding those new technologies, and whether it's telemedicine, new imaging technologies, portable point of care testing devices, and these have huge application for the military, and for, again, just in under-resourced areas, just the routine provision of medical care. And so a study like yours is valuable, and somebody's going to want to read that. And so don't underestimate kind of the quality of the work you're doing.
Yeah, I will just throw in too, you always have to think about wilderness medicine as being an integrative type of field. So where that might be applicable, not so much for diving, is you have to think about displaced people and refugees. So I'll give you an example. A friend of mine was very involved with MSF. So he described to me that he was on a ship rescuing refugees out of the water in the Mediterranean. And they had to determine who was sick or not sick, with sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds. So they used a simple approach of, please, everybody stand up. And those people who couldn't stand up were probably sick. So this is where you can then apply your ultrasound technology, in that you've identified a group of people who have been immersed, who've been on the water using kind of your water approach, but use it now for triage. You could use it for management, and think about reassessment of management. So the idea that you can now do this feasibility study going, hey, I could bring a butterfly onto a boat, I can use this to evaluate patients in a way, allows for many different types of people to apply that in different ways. And that's the really nice thing about wilderness medicine. This is not a box, right? This is maybe this hub and spoke wilderness, or it's all the stuff pointing back into wilderness, but you use it for different approaches. So keep going. That's really a great idea.
You have a question here? couldn't completely hear that, but it sounds like you had some pretty good ideas.
So for our climate change impact on search and rescue, it looked like in 2016 there was a National Geographic Arctic search and rescue missions double as climate warms, and there was also something done by the Canadian Air Force. So there's some data out there, but it probably needs to be updated and redone. So if you want to work on that, we can talk about this and kind of make it happen.
Yeah, and if you want to, we're doing, I just on the flight down here, I was looking at one of my fellows' research project for next year. I don't think you're going to scoop him. But we're doing a lot of work with Native Alaskan populations above the Arctic Circle, and with the permafrost underlying all the structures up there in the northern latitudes, high latitudes, warming 3 to 4 times faster than anywhere else on the planet. It's kind of ground zero for climate change and its impact on infrastructure, on ability to have clean water, and on health. And so we're doing some survey research looking at, and we haven't really done it in the lower 48 that I'm aware of sufficiently, is looking at how climate change is impacting our patient population in the ED right now. So yeah, please follow up. I'd be happy to plug you in and get you involved up north or elsewhere.
Anyone else? Yep.
Just a thought on the climate change idea. You can almost maybe use the lower 48 as sort of like a control group in that climate change is happening much, much faster near the poles than it is in like the lower 48, so that you could look at changes in search and rescue in multiple different places.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a great
no.
point.
I'm sorry. No, I think that's exactly right. But I think where it's especially interesting up there is you got subsistence cultures that have been there for 6,000 to 8,000 years, and the knowledge that allows them to safely traverse. So these are roadless areas, and the only way you can get around is by foot or on a sled or on a boat on a very narrow window in the summertime. And so places that kind of the multi-generational knowledge was this time of year you can be on this part of the sea ice and you were absolutely fine is suddenly now not relevant. And so you start getting into cultural values and integrity, and that's influence on kind of the subsistence lifestyle and ability to maintain social structures. So, and that's going to be happening, it's already happening to a degree in the lower 48, but it's sure as hell going to be happening a lot more. And I don't mean to drag us completely down into climate change, because mountains are cool too, and dive medicine's cool too, so don't think that this is the only one thing to do. But there are a lot of ways that what happens outside the hospital is the critical value for what's going to be happening inside the hospital, and we need to change that mindset within medicine. Should we?
Any other of your research questions that you have or projects that you?
So we were just thinking about it. We're from Michigan, so there's a lot of freshwater lakes and inland lakes, and so like Swimmer's Edge. I was wondering if like changing climate would increase like algae blooms and like more cases of Swimmer's Edge like presenting to the ER, and kind of like what the standard treatment for that is.
That sounds like a great research question. There's a lot of lakes there.
Yeah. Well, and our residency's like 5 minutes from Lake Michigan, so.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, so that's a great project, just to interject, and this is easy. I don't want to say it's easy, but this is where you actually utilize your EHR, right?
Right.
You know, you look for your codes, you look for a way to either do a diagnosis search. This is just the practical stuff. What's the ICD-10 code for this? Maybe you actually do the work of standardizing this in your department or your network of going, hey, anytime we have a patient that looks like this, you know, please use these codes. So then you can search, and you have a patient list, and then you basically have your data, right? And you can create the story. In terms of treatment, you know, that's a little bit, that's a second question. Like, that's a different question. But in terms of like incidents, you look at temperatures, you look at blooms, you look at local reports, and you look at visits, and
We pulled a partner with like the
Yeah.
DNR, too, 'cause I know they look at all of them.
yeah, that's how you do that, and that's how you can use your EHR to answer these kind of ecological questions.
Thanks.
In regards to the search and rescue, like kind of being out of Michigan as well, would be to look at like the Coast Guard. So in regards to like rescues and climate change, and like, you know, imagine they have a data set of like when they go out, and then looking at, you know, time of year and different trends, I guess, in regards to like these severe weather conditions that they're going out in. And so now you're endangering other people, obviously, as you're trying to like rescue these people because of climate change, and like you're having to go out in like rougher and rougher conditions.
And that's a great point. And then the other part of that is, like we talked about, is are we seeing more rescues because more people are out there, or are we seeing more rescues because of the elemental changes that we're seeing in the environments that we're in, right? Because the conditions are becoming more extreme. There are higher waves, it's colder, it's more rain, more snow, less rain, less snow. You know, whatever environment you're operating in, is that environment becoming more extreme, more inhospitable to you to come in and recreate in it? And so, are we seeing more of that because of the climate change, or is it because of the increased participation, or is it both? Right? And so that's where you would need, this is where you need a statistician to kind of help you kind of look at that, and that's where you'd want to get them involved. We didn't really talk about that, but that's where, when you're designing your questions, you really want to get a statistician involved as early as possible, so they can help you craft that question in the best way so that you can get the most usable data. I was the king of getting non-usable data. I mean, it was like, let me ask every question I can possibly ask. We did a survey of like almost 1,000 paddlers, and they were super happy to give you information. Most of it wasn't helpful at all. I mean, we gathered this data probably 7 years ago. We're still sorting through it, trying to find something that's actually usable. And so it's just super frustrating because you have all this gold mine of data there. It's gold, Jerry, it's gold, but it's really not usable. And so if we'd gotten a statistician involved early, they can help you craft those questions and determine, you know, what's the best way to phrase this in a survey, or when you're looking at it, what's the best metric to kind of use when you're applying these things across the board.
And in the same way, if you talk to your statistician, they can help you set up your database so that it actually is easy for them to analyze and easier for you to analyze in kind of the same way, not just asking the right questions, but putting it into a format that is like going to be useful. Like, you know, it seems simple, but yes or no, coding that is like 1 and 0, is a whole lot easier for the statistician to kind of work with, you know, just for an example, and putting it into like a format in your database that makes sense. So you guys have probably heard of RedCap, right? They actually have apps that go on phones and on iPads that are really pretty useful for this type of thing, because you can take an iPad or a phone lots of places and you can get a lot of data from that. In fact, they've got accelerometers in them and all kinds of information you can get from that. I used that in one of my recent studies. And I'm still analyzing the data, in part because when I imported it into the database from all these different apps, it's nearly impossible for the statistician to like put it together in a usable format. So I basically had to get a bunch of students to help me like rearrange it within the database. And so it's taken like forever to analyze because of that. So again, talking to your statistician early is really helpful. Getting students involved is really helpful too. They usually want to do more interesting things than move charts around and tables. So.
That is also another plug for getting a student involved, because a lot of the medical schools will offer free data support to medical students. They don't offer free data support to attendings. So if you get a medical student on there, then they can help you out, right? And so it's all about working together. You're helping them, they're helping you. It's symbiosis, right? It just works that way.
And they have to have a lot of like time. So like, you know, it's hard to get residents to get like, because you basically have 1 or 2 like elective months, then maybe you can get out of the hospital for that. But students, especially in their 4th year, have quite a bit of extra time or the summers. So I mean, the last trip I went to Nepal, I took 7 students with me, and like they did a lot of the work, like tons of it. So, and they love going, and it really helps them out with their applications for everything. They've got all this, you know, experience, and and they really enjoy it. And they also help you get your data. So, I know there's another question up here.
Oh yeah, it was another topic that I was kind of interested in. So I'm interested in hyperthermia. So like heat stroke research and looking at it as a function of heat storage rather than core body temperature. And I kind of got into this through an aerospace medicine route, looking at like cooling systems for like spacesuits. But I ended up kind of thinking along wilderness medicine lines, because I feel like that's the best population to study as an analog. And so what I've been interested in is trying to get some way to measure cooling of hyperthermia patients, like at the time where cooling started. So like marathon runners who come in with heat stroke, and trying to figure some way in the field to reliably measure the amount of heat that we are cooling out of them, either through like change in water temperature, through like a cooling bath or something like that. And some of the difficulties I've had is trying to figure out where that can feasibly be done, because it's not easy to bring some kind of like extensive system to measure all of that into the field. And so I didn't know if you had any thoughts on like ways to kind of get equipment like that.
Yeah, this is where collaboration with your other divisions and departments is really helpful. So in the EMS, they have some of those wearable devices that may be able to kind of help you measure some of the temperatures. And also in the military, there are devices that they have, wearables that they have. And I believe even astronauts have these things. So they do make small ones that are portable and can go. So probably going down more of like the EMS and seeing what other things are out there. So I know that our EMS group has these like wearable devices where they get they're testing them to get information about patients as they're coming in from the field, especially ones that are farther away. So that might be more helpful because it's not one of those big bulky things to bring in. So.
And there are definitely ways, there are a couple of different options. So USAREUM, the U.S. Army Research Institute for Environmental Medicines in Natick, Mass., and they have an altitude section and a thermal medicine section. So they do a lot of work in that area. That might be one option. And then there are probably going to be 3 new space medicine fellowships in the next academic year, working with NASA and SpaceX. And that might be another way, especially with your aerospace background, that you could investigate that.
There's another question back here.
Oh, I was just saying, we also have the ability as like wilderness medicine to interact with populations like hunters. So you could look at whether the incidence of Lyme disease is actually estimated incidence, or whether COVID-19 is present in your population, but the rates has been reported in some other places. That kind of thing is all also ideas. I've got some ideas, so I can't think of now. I think it was look.
Yeah, absolutely. Expanding our ideas out to, you're right.
And I'm sorry, may I ask where you're coming from?
I'm in residency in Minnesota. I'm from Hawaii,
I'm sorry, you're in residency in?
Sarasota.
Oh, outstanding. That's cool. Yeah, they are.
You have a natural heat sink. And if you're putting someone in a water bath, you have a heat sink of known size with a known thermal mass. And you know the properties at which that should change for a given day in humidity. And so if you assume that the only other actor on that system is the human that is then in the heat sink, you may have a simple subtractive method of calculating how much heat you're pulling off of someone without it involving a wearable. Might be a way to consider approaching it.
I have a completely undeveloped question that I've been sort of thinking about a little bit. Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So I'm kind of interested in disaster medicine along with this sort of austere environment. And I've been sort of toying with the idea of like a mobile urgent care or a kind of a unit set up that could go, respond to people, kind of like EMS, but respond and take care of people at the site, and what impact that would have on both EMS traffic and overwhelming of the EDs in a disaster scenario or like a mass casualty event.
No, I'd say chase it hard. I mean, the intersection between wilderness medicine, which is just resource-limited medicine under austere conditions, I mean, that is disaster medicine, and that can be Manhattan after Sandy. It can be the coast of Japan after the earthquake, tsunami disaster there. So there's a huge amount of overlap just in our shop in those two areas. So no, I think, again, it's that idea of the new technologies coming online, telemedicine and monitoring, that allows you to bring expert level care to wherever the patient is in need. It's where medicine needs to go, so.
Great. I think unfortunately we're out of time, but, and the next group is clearly trying to come in. But the four of us will be around for the rest of the meeting, and we'll go outside down the hallway if you guys want to talk with us one-on-one. So thanks so much for coming.
The key thing is just y'all are doing exactly the right thing in coming to something like this. So if you're curious, reach out to people, talk to people, and the world opens up. Don't remain isolated. So while we love the wilderness, we're a sociable group, and be curious and reach out for help. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.